Hey everybody, we're live. It's another Friday live at the Grayzone, except it's not Friday, it's Saturday. I was traveling all yesterday. I've been on the road for the week, and Aaron looks like you're not at home. That looks like Jimmy Dore's plasma screen.
Yes, it is. It is.
How's
Correct.
LA?
It's a good time. It's a good time. I've been guest hosting for Jimmy, and I have another. This week is my last one, but it's been a good time. And thanks everybody for joining us. And a reminder to like the stream because that helps us for some reason. Because odds are we're being censored by the powers that be. So when you like the stream, that helps us bypass the filters a little bit, I guess. And yeah, thanks for being here with us on this Saturday.
Yeah, so I actually caught up with Jimmy in Nashville, where he was at Zany's. So you were filling in to facilitate that, and it was a great scene. The club was completely packed for Jimmy. I mean, he had just come off another huge show in Minneapolis. He's killing it. He went for like 45 minutes straight, and Steph opened, and then she introduced a young comedian and brought me on. I don't know why. I guess her last joke was that I was young. And I think my first set was way too experimental. And there were like random people walking in from the street. So they had no idea what I was talking about. There were like spaces of just, dead sound and you could hear a pin drop on some, jokes that you and like our audience here would clearly get. And then the second set, it was all Jimmy Dore fans. It was like, when I mentioned, I got a standing ovation coming out because it was like our people representing for us and for Jimmy. I got to meet so many people there who were supporters. And obviously that set went way better. Then, I checked in on some old friends in Dallas, fed some horses there in the suburbs of Plano, and now I'm somewhere in Mexico, and I'm hoping that my Wi-Fi holds up for this stream because last night it mysteriously went out. But we're gonna give it a shot.
Max, can I ask how long is your set when you open up for Jimmy?
He gave me 15 minutes. I went for like 18, and then there's this light. They say like there's a light that tells you that you have 2 minutes left, but they don't tell you where the light is. And the light turned out to be like to my right. And so I kind of went over time. But yeah, I mean, someone in the chat is like, Max bombed, haha. Like, no, I definitely didn't bomb in my first set. It just wasn't like the response I expected. And building up to Magoobies between DC and Baltimore in July. So I felt like trying out some new material.
So you're opening up again for Jimmy in Baltimore, in DC.
Yeah. And I'm actually my name's on the bill this time.
Nice.
So maybe you can make it down. I don't know. It's a lot easier than journalism.
I having done both, I do not agree. I have done 5 minutes, and I bombed so hard, and I thought this was the hardest thing in the world. So you're a natural, and it's impressive. The fact you can do.
But where were you doing stand-up?
I was doing some open mics a long time ago, some open mics in New York City. And
if I did an open mic in New York, like it would be liberals and they'd hate me. Like they would like riot. Like I would get.
Yeah, but my comedy wasn't even political. It just wasn't. It was just bombing. So it was bombing. So bad. Anyway, the point is, it's great. It's so cool that you get to, explore this medium and do it with such a great crowd as Jimmy's. I've been to Jimmy's shows, and the crowds are just incredible.
Yeah, they are.
It's great to meet people there and hear from them, what, our little corner of the internet means for them, like the Grayzone and Jimmy Dore. It's always great. So it's really cool. And if you're playing in July, I'll try to make it down.
Yeah, I mean, it's about community, and I think we should be doing some more Grayzone stuff in person just to meet people. But I met one supporter who is a direct descendant of one of the founders of Nashville, who is a former Illinois state senator, who's just disgusted at how pro-war the Democrats have become. And I met 4 guys from the former Yugoslavia who were journalists there who, told me what it was like before their country was destroyed, and on and on. So it's really, I learn a lot from all the people I meet, and hope to do more. So yeah, there's a lot to talk about today. You probably covered it all already this week, but I feel like we have a few angles to add. We haven't really covered Tucker's ouster. We got Somalia, we got Ukraine. I don't know if you want to do anything first, or we should get Tucker out of the way.
Yeah, let's get Tucker out of the way, because that was the news of the week. It's a big story. The biggest, the top-rated cable news host being just out of the blue ousted from his own show, and told, I think, just a few minutes before it was announced publicly, and not given a chance to do one final show to say goodbye to his audience. Just Tucker Carlson just ousted, and a lot of speculation as to what really happened, and that's all we can really do at this point, is speculate. But one factor that I keep coming back to is it's just a fact that for all the disagreements that people like us have with Tucker Carlson on many issues, it's just a fact that on cable news, he was the only place that was airing anti-war voices consistently, whether it's the war in Ukraine or the proxy war in Syria. That was a consistent source of anti-war views, and people don't like it when we say that, but it's just true. It's not. It doesn't necessarily. It doesn't mean that Tucker Carlson was right about everything. And again, there's so many things where I vehemently disagree with him, but on these core issues, he stood apart, and I have to guess or speculate that was probably a factor in him being fired so abruptly.
It's obvious. It's so obvious that the content of his show that cut against the grain of every other cable news host, especially Sean Hannity, who follows him, whose ratings are tanking now that Tucker's off. It's obvious when he's the top rated host. It's obvious that was the reason. That was what caused him to come into conflict with Murdoch's sons, who were like centrists, and that there was enormous pressure. Now, advertiser pressure is always a factor. I don't know why everyone is discounting that. First, there was advertiser pressure on Tucker that caused a lot of advertisers to drop out because, he was pro-Trump. He was, pushing the line on a lot of issues where we totally disagree with him on it. And then Mike Lindell, my pillow guy, comes in and fills the void. But that is not, Mike Lindell is the top advertiser on Fox News, but he's not the only major advertiser. And many of those who advertise on Fox News are big pharma. And Tucker was also upsetting big pharma interests when he broke away from the COVID consensus and started harshly criticizing the mRNA vaccine, the lockdowns, and everything else. And if we look at who actually is sponsoring Fox News beyond Mike Lindell, it's as I said, it's big pharma, GlaxoSmithKline, Novartis, and then BlackRock, which owns a lot of the pharmaceutical companies, are right behind MyPillow. Then the largest institutional owner is Vanguard. They have a 7% stake. BlackRock just increased its stake. They're the 2 largest owners of Pfizer. They're the 2 largest owners of Johnson & Johnson. They own over 15% of Fox. So they also own 15% of Johnson & Johnson, and they own 13% of Moderna. So the idea that Big Pharma wasn't interested in this, or the Pentagon, Politico has a piece out. I don't have it right in front of me. Department of Defense officials celebrating Tucker's ouster because they were sick of him. What they say? What did they say? We're sick of him bagging on our military night after night. So,
yeah, they portrayed it as like Tucker was insulting the rank and file, when really, actually, they also actually admitted that he's popular with the rank and file. And what they don't like, and here's the article, is that he was criticizing the proxy war in Ukraine. That's what really this is all about. There it is. That's just an amazing headline in itself. Like, good riddance. Pentagon officials cheer Tucker. Like, the fact that you have the Pentagon openly celebrating the ouster of a journalist, like of a television host, it really says something. And, the way this article frames it is they want to suggest it's because Tucker was critical of like the Pentagon's diversity policies and all that stuff. You think Pentagon leaders care that a cable news host is making fun of their diversity policies or whatever those are? No, he was pushing back against the consensus on the Ukraine proxy war and questioning constantly with his monologues and his guests the need to pour tens of billions of dollars into this proxy war in Ukraine. Of course, that's what they're upset about. And that's why they can't contain their glee now that he's out. Good riddance. And, I hope people who tried to just dismiss Tucker Carlson's anti-war views or his, I shouldn't say anti-war views, but his coverage that was critical of the proxy war in Ukraine. I hope they look at that and reflect on, like, maybe they should reflect the fact that they're in lockstep with the Pentagon here in cheering the ouster of a host and what that maybe means about their stance. Because again, for all the things to disagree with him on, it's just a fact. He consistently aired anti-war voices on the proxy war in Ukraine, no matter what his own motives were. I don't care what his own personal motives are. I mean, even if like the criticism of is, okay, he was only critical of the proxy war in Ukraine because he wants us to fight a war with China. And yeah, he was definitely a hawk on China, but that doesn't actually negate the fact that he was airing and allowing on people who were very critical of the war and airing factual critiques that weren't allowed anywhere else. And also, whenever it came down to it, he actually expressed criticism of the Biden administration when they were warmongering with China. And he also had guests on like Jimmy Dore and Doug McGregor, who all openly opposed war with China. So even there, this narrative of him that he was a China hawk, there's elements of truth to it, but it misses the fact that he allowed on voices that dissented from that, and even himself sometimes pushed back on the warmongering when it comes to China and Taiwan.
We have a comment from Danny Haifong. The advertising angle is compelling, as is Murdoch's attraction to DeSantis. Even controlling for politics, it's obvious Tucker Carlson was too independent for Fox Corporation. And, Danny would be someone who would take extreme issue with a lot of Tucker's stances on China. But I think, and Tucker was definitely someone I would consider to be anti-China, or at least anti-China system, and someone who has issued warnings about China influencing the United States and U.S. politics and the U.S. system that definitely fueled a new Cold War narrative. But it's complex, and we're going to get into that. I think it's important, if you had a relationship with his show, because you've been on the show like we have. You've been on it more than I have. I went on once to denounce Russiagate from a left anti-imperialist point of view back in 2017. It was like the first time anyone got to do that on national TV. And what I said is they're just setting the stage for a giant war. And I've been proven right, unfortunately. We had Anya Parampil go on to, at Tucker's urging, denounce the coup in Venezuela, a coup against a socialist-oriented country, and to denounce Trump's coup. And that got directly to Trump. I mean, we know that Trump responded to that and saw that. And then Anya came back on to denounce the junta, the coup regime that Hillary Clinton brought in Honduras, and to address how the migration crisis from Honduras is really the result of U.S. regime change operations and foreign policy. And that, this is something that I think right-wingers needed to understand better. She was providing important context. And, Tucker invited me on many other times when I couldn't make it, to talk about how harmful NATO was to the United States. But at every point, I was presenting what I consider to be an anti-war, anti-imperialist analysis. And you were too, Aaron. You played a lot of those clips in your segment guest hosting for Jimmy this week. And I think that's important to understand. And it's also important for people, if they want to celebrate Tucker's ouster from an anti-war angle, that they actually have to have had watched his show, consumed it regularly. And I don't think any of them did.
Yeah, if you go back to your clip from, that was 2017, when you were on about Russiagate. That was like the June or July 2017, so relatively early on in Russiagate. One of the things you warned about is that Russiagate was going to be repurposed to attack the left, to attack a Bernie Sanders style candidate, which is exactly what happened. And people who don't appreciate the opportunity to say stuff like that are then basically saying that we should cede the cable news space entirely to pro-Russiagate, pro-war views, and not take the opportunity to warn about how this is not just dangerous for the world, but also just really, really bad for the left. And we weren't allowed to say that on any of the leftist shows, not only on like the, nominally leftist shows on MSNBC. Like, back then Chris Hayes was sort of branded as like the progressive voice on MSNBC, which of course is now like a bygone memory. He doesn't pretend anymore. But even on, again, like the establishment left-wing shows like Democracy Now!, we weren't allowed on those shows to make that point either. The only place we could say it was on the show of this right-wing host, Tucker Carlson, who made space for voices like us over many years and over many issues, not just on Russiagate, but then the Ukraine proxy war when that broke out, and also on the Syria dirty war, which everybody else either whitewashes or ignores. And again, the fact that you can go and just dismiss all that, you must be saying that you don't think the Syria dirty war is important. And internally, I think that position, accordingly, I think that position actually internalizes some hegemony right there, and accepts hegemony, that we have the right to spend billions of dollars on a dirty war in Syria, and it's someone who actually covers it. It doesn't matter. It's inconsequential. It's not worth acknowledging. Same with the other examples you mentioned of the coup in Venezuela. So yes, Tucker Carlson personally, I think, expressed some views that I found to be very vile, like about immigrants, the way he talked about them, the way he talked about certain individual politicians, even the ones I disagree with, like the Squad. I didn't like it, but hegemony and supremacy can be expressed in different ways. And if you're dismissing somebody who actually singularly covers dirty wars and coups in whether it's Syria or Venezuela, I think you're internalizing some acceptance of hegemony there as well.
Well, it's not strategic. I mean, if you are part of the tiny anti-war movement in the US, whether you're left or right, you just don't have the luxury of carefully choosing your national platform, because every other host is attacking you, the position you represent. They're calling you a Russian asset. They're undermining you. They're discrediting you in the eyes of the entire public. And you have you don't have the luxury. That's why I would take every chance I got to go on RT America because they gave me also a national platform. At one time, they were broadcasting on cable TV that anyone could access. So it's not strategic. It's actually kind of it really helps me understand better the boutique left that also attacked the Rage Against the War Machine rally, because there was a coalition of libertarians and left anti-war forces when that rally clearly broke through. It helps me better understand the boutique left's attack on Tulsi Gabbard when she came in to disrupt the pro-war consensus among the Democratic primary candidates. They came in and attacked her harshly. Jacobin, the same kind of people that are celebrating Tucker's ouster supposedly from the anti-war left. And the way they come at him is so dishonest. I want to address a few of these attacks that I think contain some facts about Tucker's background that are like cringeworthy, but I think they're intellectually dishonest, and they're coming from people, including people I really respect that I've worked with. This is from Alan McLeod and Mint Press. This is an older one that's been going around, and it's about how Tucker wanted to be in the CIA when he was younger. You know, his father is a huge neocon. He would acknowledge that. And he went to Nicaragua when his dad was involved with the Contras, I think. Alan is one of the best media critics, left-wing or anti-imperialist media critics around. And he's a great writer, and we've published him at the Grayzone. The thing about that piece is it doesn't say anything about the meaning of Tucker in the current media environment, and it contains, from one of the best media critics around, no content analysis. Absolutely no content analysis. No analysis of what Tucker is actually saying night in and night out when he has a chyron behind him that says DC War Machine, and he's just hammering the imperialists, the neocons, and then hosting people like us. So what is the point of that? It's to keep it's almost like it's to keep leftists away from Tucker so the lines remain clean. But it doesn't accomplish anything when he's being disruptive and providing us a platform. Then we have, I don't know if you want to add anything there, but there were it's tons of pieces that came out this week from left writers about why we should separate.
Yeah, I agree, and it's interesting. I mean, this is where you and I split from other people who we really, really agree with on pretty much everything else. But on this one, I agree with you that I think that there's a blind spot, and I'm all for them condemning his actual views that they don't like. And there's plenty again that I think is pretty distasteful, that I found very offensive, things he said before. But to then do that without recognizing that there was some really substantive critiques and just allowance for perspectives that were not aired anywhere else on critical issues of war and peace, I think that's really disingenuous. So criticize him all you want, but then criticize him for his actual views. And it's intellectually dishonest to dismiss those areas where he was far superior than anything else on cable news, and I would say most leftist media on some issues, not everything, on some issues, but specifically on really important issues like
on Ukraine, all elected progressive officials combined, he was better. And that is one of the most important issues if you're in the anti-war movement. And if the U.S. fails in Ukraine to achieve its goals, what it considers victory, which is retaking even Crimea, Western hegemony starts to unravel. So I think it's a pretty pivotal issue. So why would you celebrate the loss of that unless you're just going to be open? Some people are open about it and they say, well, we're also losing someone who attacks the gender ideology I believe in, or we're also losing someone who says racist things. And if you want to make it about social issues, that would be a more intellectually honest take. But the angle that I see a lot of anti-war people on the left taking, including some, and there's some, I'll straight up say if I don't respect a writer or a pundit or a professional sectarian left activist, I'll straight up say it. But I mean, this is from someone who I think, deserves some respect. Branko Marcetic at Jacobin, he's done a great job on Ukraine. But, the tendency here, to me, this reflects to me an ultra-left tendency and also a slightly unfair interpretation of Tucker's anti-China views, because when the beef is about to cook with Taiwan, Tucker has actually taken a line against military confrontation there. So let's just examine one part of this piece by Branko. He says, as Carlson's coverage of Pelosi's Taiwan visit indicated, even the occasional dovish segment on Tucker Carlson tonight expressing alarm over the risk of provoking Beijing was framed around the need to shore up U.S. military strength when Congress is passing record military budgets and blah, blah, blah. The U.S. military budget is high. So it wasn't good enough. The segment wasn't good enough for him, and therefore it deserves to be denounced, even though no other cable host was taking on Nancy Pelosi's extremely provocative, warmongering visit to Taiwan, which has helped set the stage or accelerate the current crisis. So what good is it to denounce that? Let's take a look at the segment.
Was anybody on MSNBC or CNN criticizing Nancy Pelosi for trying to stoke a war? Which I mean, no, of course not. And by the way, even the framing, Tucker Carlson is not an anti-imperialist. No shit. Who says he's an anti-imperialist? The point is, does he air anti-imperialist voices that are otherwise shunned and maligned? The answer is yes. So then who cares if he's not personally an anti-imperialist? I don't care about his own personal views. It's a question of what he airs on air, especially when those views are not allowed anywhere else.
I mean, it's a question of having a realistic outlook on politics in the United States. There's the anti-war movement is being actively destroyed by every other host, including Sean Hannity. But there's so little alarm. Do you ever notice that? There's so little alarm among leftists about Sean Hannity's existence. When Hannity, he's completely consistent with the DC Uniparty and with the anti-immigrant, xenophobic, anti-gay, anti-feminist, anti-abortion Republicans, for the most part. Maybe he's not as articulate or compelling as Tucker, but if Sean Hannity was asked, I don't think there'd be this flood of articles justifying it, and it's weird to me. So I actually can't pull up the segment because my Wi-Fi is too weak, but it's right below. If
I can share it,
if you want to share it, this is. Yeah. We'll play some Tucker China clips because I mean you played a lot of clips from him on Ukraine, and his views are pretty well known, just demolishing Zelensky night after night. But I find this interesting.
This week with the black, she's definitely coming, one source told the Wall Street Journal. The only variable is whether she spends the night. So Nancy Pelosi goes to Taipei. What's the effect of that? Well, we don't need to guess. The Chinese government has said repeatedly and clearly that if Nancy Pelosi lands in Taiwan, it could trigger a global war. Watch.
A Chinese spokesperson said there would be serious consequences for the visit over the weekend, conducting military drills at sea.
If House Speaker Pelosi insists on visiting Taiwan, China will take resolute and strong measures to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Are they bluffing? It doesn't sound like it, actually. A representative of Chinese state media said this, quote, if U.S. fighter jets escort Pelosi's plane into Taiwan, it is an invasion. The Chinese army has the right to forcibly dispel Pelosi's plane and the U.S. fighter jets, including firing warning shots and making tactical movement of obstruction. If ineffective, then shoot them down. Oh, shoot them down. Okay. So the White House naturally was asked about this. We're suddenly on the brink of yet another global war, essentially a nuclear war, because Nancy Pelosi has been given the green light by the White House to fly to Taiwan. So what's the White House view of this? Listen.
An official who is associated with Chinese state media is suggesting that if Speaker Pelosi tries to go to Taiwan, her plane could be shot down. Does the president?
Okay, so we get the point here. But I mean, it's pretty clear. The point he's trying to get across is that dangerous pro-war elements in Washington are pushing for war with Taiwan, and that we should be opposed to that. And he was the only cable news host. He's being caricatured in all of these takes as someone who wants war with China, when I think we could go up to the line of that he is definitely pushing in new Cold War hysteria on China at some
Absolutely.
point.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I just don't see when every other cable news host is doing exactly the same thing. We have, Doug McGregor denouncing U.S. aggression against China on Tucker. I don't know if you want to play any of those.
Administration in living memory. We don't have anyone that qualifies as a statesman. Statesmanship involves advancing American interests at the least cost to the American people. None of that is in play here. We're dealing with a group of posers, people who are posturing. Posturing is not statesmanship. And the American people need to understand something that no one has bothered to tell them, that during World War II, Taiwan was the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the Imperial Japanese Armed Forces. All the major invasions of China were launched from Taiwan. Beijing will not allow Taiwan to become a garrison state.
Let's see here.
Forces or any foreign power. And if they think that we are going to ally ourselves with Taiwan, if they think we are going to intervene to defend that island in the event of a dispute, then we will be at war with China for the reasons that I just outlined. And we are not prepared for that. We are.
All right, this clip is giving me some issues. Let me try one more.
But we get the point. And Doug McGregor, not an anti-imperialist leftist. I mean, we got to tack on. Oh no, we're not going to have someone on who is like a key Pentagon advisor in a U.S. administration who's hammering U.S. policy from Ukraine to Taiwan. We're not supposed to do that. Like, you got attacked by those ultra leftists at Vanguard. What do they want us to do? Are we only supposed to have like these little like soy jack pundits on who dabble only within these small circles of ardent card-carrying socialists to denounce the war? Are we supposed to have people on who actually are involved in policy, who are making these statements and disrupting the war machine at a high level? Are we allowed to hear from them in alternative media? I mean, it's completely crazy that we're supposed to write off this entire contingent within the foreign policy. I wouldn't call the foreign policy establishment, but within an alternative elite foreign policy circles who come out of the military who are actually trying to stop a war. That's such immature politics to me.
It would be great if senior Pentagon officials like Doug McGregor, had views like Cornel West or Chris Hedges, but unfortunately, they don't really make military people like that, at least that I'm aware of. They all have, conservative social views. And the question,
well, wait a minute. No. What the Democrats and a lot of people on the left are comfortable with is like the woke generals like Mark Milley, who are putting an intersectional face on the Pentagon. And I love when Tucker denounces that, because when you see these diverse generals, or like trans generals, it's nothing against that I'm saying against trans people or any people from minority backgrounds in the military. It's that this is branding imperialism so that imperialism can be more resilient and therefore more insidious and win over more progressive people. And so it deserves to be called out. And yet Mark Milley, these generals who are unlike McGregor, who is decidedly anti-woke, are dangerous characters who are more likely to take us to nuclear war. So that's another factor here.
Yeah, and here's McGregor basically, just going back to that clip about China. This is more of what McGregor said, and this clip should work.
Why every show on TV is not covering this right now? This seems like one of the craziest things that's happened in my lifetime. Do you have any speculation and guess as to why the Biden administration would want this?
Well, the Biden administration and its predecessors, frankly, treated everything that the Russian government said for the last 15 years about Ukraine with complete contempt. They're repeating that process. We see how well that's worked out in Ukraine. The Russians were always serious. Hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost in this war in Ukraine that we should have acted quickly to stop. Now we're provoking the Chinese over an issue that is at least as strategically important to them.
So, that's an example of a guest coming on and actually, unlike every other network show at the time, pushing back on the war hysteria over China and Taiwan. And just recently there was a war game in Congress where a group of bipartisan members of Congress on the China committee, whatever it's called, did a war game scenario about going to war with China over Taiwan. And their takeaway was, we have to arm Taiwan to the teeth, much like they've said about Ukraine as well. And on cable news, this was the only show, even as Tucker Carlson fed into all this new Cold War stuff with China, he did, that was still on this issue of at least going to war, was airing voices like this.
Well, again, it comes down to motivations. Like, do I care if his motivation, if he doesn't love China or hates China's system, but does not want to get involved in a war in the South China Sea or a regional war? I mean, that is a kind of a traditional Buchananite, we could call it an isolationist position. Do I care? I mean, I'm just going to be strategic and try to stop this war. And I can't go as an anti-war figure. I can't go forward with the cable news hosts I want. I go forward with the cable news hosts we have, to paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld on the army in Iraq. And there are no cable news hosts left that I can think of who are really pushing back against this war in any meaningful way. By the way, going back to Tucker being in Nicaragua when he was young, when the Contras were being backed by the CIA to destabilize that government, did he ever support the disgusting 2018 regime change operation that took place 5 years ago? It was going on to this, like exactly 5 years ago today, when hundreds of Nicaraguans were being killed and tortured for being Sandinistas. Did he support that? Did he give any support to that? No. He moved in the opposite direction in many ways by hosting Anya on Honduras and Venezuela. So, and meanwhile,
whereas
day in and day out, CNN was supporting that regime change operation.
Yeah. And so is Democracy Now!, by the way. Democracy Now! Totally whitewashed that as well. So, I mean, that's a case where, again, there are many issues where our place like CNN and Democracy Now! Are better, I think, than Tucker on some issues. But again, on these important issues like coups abroad, proxy wars, trying to destabilize a country, you have cases where Tucker is just better. That's just true, and it shouldn't be difficult to acknowledge that. And by the way, when people bring up the fact that his father is working for Voice of America, right, in Nicaragua, and trying to basically support the propaganda operations that help sustain the dirty war in Nicaragua. Well, he also recently brought on Dan Kovalik, who has done, I think, more than a few people in the U.S. have done more to challenge the U.S. campaign against Nicaragua than Dan Kovalik. He wrote a book about it.
I can tell you, I went to Nicaragua with Dan in 2018 to do reporting on the coup. Dan was riding in the back of a pickup with me to the July 19th celebration with the Sandinistas of overcoming that coup. He's just a dyed-in-the-wool anti-imperialist from the left, and Tucker hosted him for a full hour. A full hour. I mean, this is the kind of media environment we have to embrace, in my opinion, as people who want to gain traction and educate Americans and raise their consciousness on the war state. And it's opening up to people like us. And it's not just with Tucker. We can't just remain in our little caves because, we're already losing.
Yeah. Just like there's no one who is like more like stereotypically archetypally anti-imperialist than Dan Kovalik, and he was on the Tucker show for like an hour, and they talked about Nicaragua, they talked about the new Cold War with Russia, and you will not find someone like Dan Kovalik getting an airspace anywhere else. And I just, people want me to dismiss that. Sorry, I just can't.
Yeah, and back to your point about Democracy Now! Being one of the main platforms for supporting the violent coup backed by the U.S. in Nicaragua in 2018. The U.S. left generally, in my opinion, sucks. I mean, I've just come to decide that it sucks. I don't care if you say I'm not a part of it or whatever they want to say about me. I don't care, because I've had to go through this process, first with the dirty war in Syria, where when I started to expose key elements of it, it was the left and leftist groups like the International Socialist Organization, like the modern version of the Congress on Cultural Freedom, and all those phony leftist groups that the CIA created in the 60s and 50s. They were the ones who went after me. It's today the World Socialist website that's constantly going after me because I was from the left opposing the lockdowns that absolutely destroyed the education and livelihoods of some of the most vulnerable people, not just in the United States, but around the world, and generally for nothing. I opposed the vaccine mandates from the left, and they went after me so viciously, so many of them. It started with Syria, it started with that. The left, such large swaths of the left have supported so many regime change operations and so many wars. And many of them have been, Branko's a great exception, many of them have been centered around Jacobin. And I want to take it back to Jacobin for a second, because there's another attack on Tucker. And I think there are some valid points in it. It deals with domestic politics. And I think the author, Ben Burgess, is being a little more intellectually honest on those issues. Forgive my slow Wi-Fi here. But there's one part I want to zero in on. Nice restrained headline. Tucker Carlson is a repugnant pseudo-populist fraud, blah, blah, blah. But here's an interesting part that's classic Jacobin. Compare, for instance, Carlson's segment pushing back against the idea that we should hate warmongering Russian President Vladimir Putin with the attitude of socialist leader Eugene V. Debs, who went to jail for his fiery speech opposing U.S. entry into World War I, but took it for granted that he should also denounce the German Kaiser and show solidarity with his anti-war comrades in Germany. Okay, let's just pick apart that paragraph. Tucker, according to Ben Burgess, has to denounce Vladimir Putin as a warmonger, which completely decontextualizes the position that Russia is in. It's an ahistorical statement to call Vladimir Putin a warmonger. You can criticize Putin, you can condemn his invasion. You, Aaron, took a position opposing it, but it's an ahistorical, childish statement, and it demands that Tucker do something that Eugene Debs do in order to prove his worth, which means that people on the left or who are anti-war can only necessarily support fellow travelers, and they must celebrate Tucker's ouster because he simply was not Eugene V. Debs. And by the way, the U.S. attitude towards Germany and the overall attitude of the victors of World War I towards Germany and the German Kaiser, which amounted to the Versailles Treaty, set the stage for World War II. So I don't know what's so great about denouncing Germany in World War I. Like, wow, I admire Eugene Debs, but wow. But this is classic Jacobin. Vladimir Putin's a warmonger. Vladimir Putin is an imperialist. It shows a complete lack of understanding of what imperialism is. It completely whitewashes, or it saps of meaning, the true essence of what imperialism is. And just one more point about it, Jacobin is a vehicle for Bernie Sanders. Jacobin attained influence as a vehicle for the Bernie Sanders campaign of 2016 and 2020. And two of its key editors wrote a book called like After Bernie, How We Can Continue the Bernie Legacy. Have they ever attacked Bernie like this? Because Bernie on the Ukraine war has been a complete supporter of US imperialism. He's been a rubber stamp for every aid package. He's been better on Taiwan. He's refused to support some missile sales, but the tenor of his 2020 campaign was anti-China, and I can just throw up his campaign page. It will sound a lot like Tucker. So where are they on their own guy? Why don't they, bring their boy home and give him a talk? It just doesn't feel right to me.
Yeah, I don't put any of these people on a pedestal. So Tucker has so many things I disagree with, but just like him, all these other outlets that are held up as being examples of pristine leftism have their own contradictions and blind spots as well. And again, Jacobin, you can. I mean, I like some of the stuff I read in Jacobin, but sometimes they buy into the dumbest propaganda. And same thing with Democracy Now! And there's I would never critique them as hard. I would never subject them to the kind of harsh language that we're calling Tucker a fraud and all that stuff. And it's like people have their areas where they can see clearly, and other places where they have their biases, and they fall short. In the case of leftists, I think it's even more important to hold them accountable, because we know that Tucker Carlson, we don't expect him to be the beacon of leftism. He's a right-wing host. But when left-wing outlets parrot dangerous propaganda, as we saw with Russiagate and the Syria dirty war, which places like Democracy Now! Totally fell into, then they need to be held accountable as well. And it doesn't mean I think you dismiss them entirely. It just means you allow that criticism. But we don't criticize our leftist, like outlets like Jacobin will not criticize people on the left like Bernie and Democracy Now! At all. What
about their softball interview with AOC? I mean, she's effectively pro-war. She co-sponsored an anti-China resolution with Ted Cruz denouncing China on Hong Kong. She voted for the $40 billion. They're responsible for her. So if you don't suck on the left, then you at least have a better ground to stand on to criticize Tucker. But if you're doing all of that, focus on your own house first and fix your own house, because we can't claim you as anti-war when you're responsible for AOC. You're still softballing her. You're still grandpa stroking Bernie when he's already endorsed Joe Biden. I mean, give me a break. And the ISO, which has merged with the DSA, at its socialism conference, it not only hosted China, so-called experts who are funded by the U.S. government through its regime change arm, the National Endowment for Democracy, who I believe have contributed to Jacobin. They also hosted students, supposed Nicaraguan students, who had been involved in the violent coup in Nicaragua. And again, I mean, you can just go back into Jacobin's archives. There's just piece after piece supporting the Syrian dirty war, attacking Venezuela's government. They have this guy, I think his name's Mike Gonzalez or something. They have all these Trotskyites supporting regime change. So when you want to purge all the Trotskyites and all the regime changers who are just basically proto-neocons from your midst, then the attacks might have more credibility. But it really it just doesn't feel right to me. And
Yeah.
At the Grayzone, I'm not gonna try to claim Tucker. I'm not saying or his position. We're not America first, but I'm also not claiming the position that the professional U.S. left takes anymore when they attack me every time I oppose a regime change operation.
Yep. And in the case of Syria, I mean, I've like watching the trajectory first, kind of just as someone who's not really involved at all in the issue at all, but I saw all the hits you took. It's kind of gone from like people vehemently attacking you for taking the positions you took to then once other people started affirming everything you were saying, once the truth became undeniable about the war in Syria and validating everything you were saying, then everyone's kind of just moved on and nobody wants to talk about it anymore.
Yeah, just like they moved on from COVID. All the people at Breakthrough News or whatever who like attacked me without naming me and would never debate me. They've completely moved on from that. And all the like scientifically bogus positions they took, where's the, why? I mean, I honestly, I like respect people like, in some way I respect Walker Bragman for trying to just argue for permanent lockdown still when everybody else has moved on. But, there are other people still talking about the damage this has caused, and other people have accepted accountability for being wrong. Tucker Carlson said racist, horrible things about Iraqis, but he has taken some level of responsibility, if I'm not incorrect, by acknowledging that he was wrong on Iraq. And I think a lot of what he's doing to oppose these regime change wars is a form of taking responsibility. I was wrong on Syria in 2013. And people like Vanessa Beeley or Sharmeen Narwani, like or Eva Bartlett, who are right, they have a right to like, they had a right over the years to attack me for that. They had a right. But what I'm doing is trying to take accountability for that and take responsibility for that. I don't see that kind of accountability from the professional leftists who are celebrating Tucker's ouster. And what are they going to be duped by next? Which psyop are they going to fall for next? We can only imagine, and it's going to be horrible. By the way, I think what we're going to see next is my prediction. The same kind of tenor from these same forces will be expressed towards RFK Jr. The same kind of bitter, dishonest attacks. And who are they going to run in his place? Who are they going to run for president? I mean, again, I think we have to have a strategy in the United States. We're living in a capitalist country with a public that's just drunk on what many would call reactionary media. And we have to have a strategy for reaching them and raising their consciousness. And we can't just do it alone here at the Grayzone, though I thank all 3,700 of you for watching now.
I don't know if you saw, Max, but there's a poll this week saying that RFK Jr. has 19% of the vote already, or has 19% support in the primary. And that was a Fox News poll, and some people have questioned the methodology, whatever. I don't know. But already, just like a few weeks into his run, if that figure is accurate, 19% is pretty good. And see, of course, if that picks up, he'll face more attacks. And already, I mean, we saw this week Bernie, AOC, Ilhan Omar, all of them lined up to endorse Biden without even any primary debates happening, because Democrats are actually saying they're not going to sponsor any primary debates, so maybe there's not going to be any, but none of them calling, for example, for primary debates, and all of them already throwing their support behind Biden. And what has Biden done to earn an actual progressive support? I have no idea. But Bernie, AOC, Ilhan Omar not waiting, already getting behind him.
And it is an insult to the American public that Biden is going to run again. I mean, he's clearly not fit for the presidency, and he's being controlled by neoliberal and neoconservative elements like Jake Sullivan, like Victoria Nuland, like Tony Blinken, who are dangerous, who are also unqualified, but in a different way, and are ideologically extreme. So it's very dismaying. And I'm looking at the chats right now, and people are saying, why should we support someone running as a Democrat? I get it. I feel the rage that you feel about the Democratic Party, because I come from that. I come from liberalism, and I've come to a point where I've reached a level of consciousness where I see the Democratic Party as the pro-war, pro-censorship, pro-lying, anti-worker, insidious party, where we're supposed to expect something of them, and they deliver not only nothing, but they harm workers and they slaughter people around the world. And the Republicans, well, we expected them to be like George W. Bush and to be horrible on everything, but Donald Trump, maybe he would go out of his way to try to make peace with North Korea. There were some things that were happening there that were kind of interesting. So I get it. I never supported Dem exit, though. I never supported completely getting out of the Democratic Party, because you need to have a strategy. And I think RFK, if he can actually force the issue within the Democratic Party on war, on censorship, on how they reacted to the pandemic in a way that harmed workers and vulnerable people so much, if he can force these issues, then it's worth running in the party with the Kennedy name. And forcing the issue means forcing a debate. And Biden is afraid to debate. So what he can also do is lift the mask on our fake democracy and expose for everyone that our election system is rigged, not in the way that necessarily, the mail-in ballots are rigged, or that the voting machines are rigged, but that it's rigged from the beginning to prevent anyone who isn't part of the Washington consensus from actually gaining any traction. And I think that's important for politically educating Americans, so we can start mobilizing something else. And I want to be part. And I know there are talks. There are just very vague talks right now, but I want to be part of this. There are talks of hosting a real debate of the Democrats who will not be allowed on the stage. I feel positive about this happening. There used to be third-party debates in Chicago that Larry King would host, and these are also good forums for educating people. So I'm glad RFK's there. And again, it's like with Tucker. If you didn't watch his show at all and you read these dishonest takes, then you just won't get it. And if you didn't watch RFK's announcement speech, which was far from perfect, then you still won't get it. But I think he's presenting a very different candidacy than anything I've seen in my lifetime from a Democrat. It's worth doing.
Yeah, if you look at the primaries of the last, 2 decades, people like Dennis Kucinich, Mike Gravel, and then Bernie Sanders, all their presence in those primaries was positive. Tulsi Gabbard in 2020, when she called out Kamala Harris for her policies as a prosecutor, when she criticized the dirty war in Syria, when she warned about the dangers of a new Cold War with Russia and how that was heading to an inevitable conflict, that was really valuable to have her there. And so RFK Jr., certainly right now, the only person who's, although, again, his framing of the war in Ukraine, I don't really agree with, but at least he's saying some things that at least raise questions about the war state that nobody else will raise. Everybody else just accepts the bipartisan consensus, and whatever his own angle is, it's different than mine, but he's at least raising questions, and he's accordingly being attacked for doing that.
The attacks are just beginning, and they're going to get more vicious. I went on his podcast. He hosted me to talk about Ukrainian neo-Nazis. He recently had Scott Ritter on his podcast. He also had Julian Assange's brother and father on his podcast. He knows, he gets it, and I think a lot of what he's doing in public is framing that I don't think is necessary. I think you just go balls to the wall at this point in American politics, but he's framing it in a certain way, but he knows what's up. And I've talked to him personally. This is someone who is not exactly, it's not a secret that he believes that U.S. intelligence played a role in the killing of his father and uncle. That's someone that the establishment does not want close to power. So I really, I think if I'm going to live in the United States, you live in a media center in New York, I live in Washington, D.C., I'm not going to just submit to alienation and just allow myself to be consumed in ultra-leftism and hopelessness. I'm going to look for some avenue of continuing to raise people's consciousness. Yeah. And I hope all of you watching will too.
I think if you're plugged into the Grayzone, then you definitely share those same commitments, and you're willing to transcend all the easy boxes that people want to place themselves in when they're engaging in media and politics. And we don't do that here. And I think that's why we have the people that we have who support us and watch us. And, Tucker Carlson being gone, that's the end of an era. I don't think there'll ever be a cable news host like him allowed ever again. Certainly one who's that popular. But to have like a right winger who has on, Anya Parampil, Jimmy Dore, myself, Max, back when you were going on, Glenn Greenwald, that's just not going to happen anymore. And that's the end of an era. And I doubt that Tucker Carlson's media career is coming to an end. I'm sure he has something else planned. But to have on Fox News this right-wing cable network voices like that being aired pretty consistently, that's just that was a unique moment in time, and it had to come to an end at a certain point. The system can't tolerate voices like that for that long. So this was inevitable, and I think some people are missing the importance of that, but so be it.
Yeah, and I think it's very much in line with the stage of history that the U.S. is in right now. I mean, what we've been saying about the Democratic Party, where they're essentially rigging the entire primary for Biden, who's barely there, and cable news will just not tolerate even the highest rated host in the country who has differing opinions that diverge from the Washington consensus. It really shows you where we are. It's just a constant moment of mask lifting, and I think that will accelerate during this campaign. And when we watch what happens to RFK, what happens to Trump, and it will be, I hope it's educational for everyone. Obviously, I'm not expecting any great results, but I think, it's going to be educational. This is what cable news is. It completely backs up Michael Parenti and Ed Herman's model of propaganda, what happened to Tucker Carlson. I'm sorry it's someone on the right and not someone on the left, but that's where we are in cable. There's no hope in cable news. There's no hope in establishment media. So thank you all for being here and supporting us, because, maybe in a decent society, we would have been welcomed there, but we're in the gray zone.
Should we move on to, you want to do Ukraine or Somalia?
Let's do a quick Somalia session.
Okay, I can play the first clip. I'll get it ready. Go ahead if you want to kick it. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I think we actually have a contribution from Ann Garrison that we can publish this week on this, and she's emerging as a real expert on Somalia. But basically on April 27th, and I'm pulling from her intro, which I think is really concise. On April 27th, the House voted 100-1 to 231 against Congressman Matt Gaetz's resolution to remove all U.S. troops from Somalia. This is at a point when when it looks like an escalation is coming in a fight with the Islamist group Al-Shabaab and the Somali government, which is backed up by AFRICOM, which is the U.S. imperial military cat's paw on the African continent, the U.S. Africa Command. And Somalia's president, Hassan Sheikh Mohammed, is essentially on board for the U.S. to continue to have this presence of some 900 troops in fighting Al-Shabaab. Gaetz's resolution failed by almost the same number that his resolution to remove U.S. troops from Syria failed, and it was dedicated to challenging U.S. forever wars abroad. All the co-sponsors of the resolution were Republicans, although there was slightly more Republican than Democratic support. And so now let's listen to Matt Gaetz's rationale for introducing this resolution.
Great honor to participate in this debate with my esteemed colleague, Mr. Meeks of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and with a great patriot such as Mr. James of Michigan. I want to welcome the American people to the second part in a legislative series we are conducting about all of the places on the planet Earth where Congress still believes that 9/11 justifies current U.S. troop presence in 2023. And the first in that series was Syria. And I came to this floor, only got about 103 votes. But I made the argument that our troops were essentially sitting ducks, guarding oil extraction operations where their presence was known, where their location was easily identifiable. And I called for a withdrawal. That withdrawal was defeated. And then precisely what I predicted, more U.S. casualties from Iranian drones. That's what happened. Exactly what I said would occur. And it is with no joy I say that. And I know all of us would take any policy position we could to reduce U.S. casualties. And I think this debate will present an excellent opportunity to reflect on Somalia in that light. There are currently 900 U.S. troops in Somalia, give or take, and this resolution would bring them home. Somalia is a country of 17 million, tortured at times by al-Shabaab, a group of roughly 7,000 hardened fighters and even more sympathizers. But to believe any of the arguments, just logically, that my colleagues are making, you have to believe that 900 U.S. troops is what is going to save a country of 17 million from a hardened group of 7,000. I think that strains not only logic, but our understanding of the history of Somalia, a country that has oscillated between failed state and just absolute coup revolution over and over again, civil war, sectarian violence. The future of Somalia must be determined by Somalia. And to the extent that foreign influences could be helpful, I would argue that the African Union is far better positioned to build a stronger sense of national identity and national unity among clans that have been warring in Somalia for generations than U.S. troops. I have yet to see the evidence that U.S. troops are the essential element to fusing relationships among warring African warlords, clans, and tribes.
Okay, I think we can stop there. I mean, this should have been the job of Ilhan Omar, who is of Somali. She's a Somali American who has family who are. Her clan is actually in government now. Actually, her first, I think I covered it. Her last husband is an advisor to the Somali president. And I think a little bit of history is in order before we present the opposition to Matt Gaetz's resolution, which is that the U.S. created this problem in Somalia, 100%. I mean, you can go back to U.S. military interventions and to supposedly oust al-Qaeda from Somalia, the fighting in Mogadishu, when Anthony Zinni said he didn't even care about the body count of Somali people. The constant intervention by the U.S. there was essentially stopped by al-Shabaab because al-Shabaab cleaned up the chaos. Al-Shabaab was simply a coalition of moderate and maybe a little more extreme Islamist groups that called themselves the Islamic courts when they came into government. They were extremely popular, or this was the post 9/11 era. And after stabilizing the country, the U.S. went to Ethiopia when it was under the control, I believe, of the TPLF, who are now out of government, and the U.S. is backed in this other proxy war, and essentially sent their military in to remove the Islamic courts, install a fake government backed by the African Military Command. They controlled a series of blocks in Mogadishu, basically a green zone. And al-Shabaab grew more extreme and more violent as they fought to return to power. And now the U.S. continues to fight al-Shabaab to maintain control over its government. There was a popular leader, and Ann Garrison has written about this for us, Mohamed Farmajo, who was elected president in Somalia. The U.S. started to put pressure on him to call elections, and Ilhan Omar was leading the charge in her role on the Africa Subcommittee in the House Foreign Relations Committee, while members of her family were waiting in the wings to serve for his successor. Farmajo wanted to create a Somali Coast Guard, which was independent of AFRICOM, because the West is dumping on Somalia's coast. There are also weapons flowing in, and he was advocating for more sovereignty. Many people in the Somali diaspora considered him a legitimate anti-imperialist leader, and so he was forced out. And now this government is completely on board with what the U.S. is doing, and there's so much momentum in Washington and at the Pentagon to ramp up U.S. troop presence. So what Matt Gaetz is doing here, coming from a district which is heavily represented by veterans in the Florida Panhandle, is disrupting the U.S. plan to expand its presence in Africa. And let's play Ryan Zinke, who former Secretary of Interior, now he's in Congress, and his rationale for keeping troops in Somalia. Aaron, I don't know if you can tee that up because.
Yes, I can. And Ryan Zinke, he is the Congress member who, during the vote in over Syria. Okay, you have it. Well, he said that we have to fight ISIS over there in Syria, so we don't fight them over here.
Well, this is a similar argument.
3 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition, but I agree with my distinguished colleagues from Florida that Congress has an obligation to review it. Congress should not abrogate our responsibility. We should ask the tough questions. And ultimately, we should provide the funding necessary and the resources to win. That's our job, and I agree with you 100%. But as a commander, they are doing more than just guarding an embassy. A force structure of 900 may seem like a large footprint, but those of us who remember Black Hawk Down would suggest otherwise. A force requires medevac. Those medevac require people that service those aircraft. In case we get in trouble, we need a quick reaction force, a force large enough to defend our troops. Because I, and like my colleagues, know that if you were to put any American servicemen in harm's way, we want to ensure we have the adequate force to make sure they're recovered safely. They also have to be fed. Communications. In order to have an effective force, you need a footprint that can do its mission. What I also agree with is that we should have a plan. Before we unplug our obligations, we should know what unplugging it does and when, and also we should have a plan on what our obligations are. So much of this discussion is a discussion among similar views. We do have an obligation for freedom.
An obligation.
Commitment to democracy.
And what democracy are they really building there? I mean, this is a deeply undemocratic system. I don't want to get into the details, but the U.S. is not allowing a full country vote, and it's kept Al-Shabaab out of power through force. But it's about freedom for Ryan Zinke, former Navy SEAL, energy industry guy from Montana, and he's on the military committee. I mean, it's just a bunch of nonsense. All he's saying is there's going to be an escalation, and Somalia obviously is strategically important for the U.S. because of its location along the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa. There was just a major proxy war that finally seemed to have reached its end in Ethiopia. So that's what this is about. Aaron, were you going to play something else?
Let me play for you guys what Zinke said about back when Gaetz had a measure to withdraw U.S. forces from Syria, what Zinke said.
The hard truth is this. Either we fight them in Syria or we'll fight them here.
Oh, man.
Either we fight and defeat them in Syria or we'll fight in the streets of our nation.
You have to admire his confidence in both cases. Like, he's so sure of himself in advocating for staying in Syria and Somalia and in invoking the memory of Black Hawk Down. What is he talking about? So you want to have another, like, you want to replicate that whole thing where we invade Somalia and fight people in Somalia. And his answer to that is to just basically send in more troops so that the U.S. has a better chance this time. Anyway. But again, how many times do we hear about the U.S. occupation of Somalia and Syria? It only happens when U.S. forces get hurt, especially in Syria. And their policy is just to put young U.S. forces in harm's way. But my question is, so we know the hegemonic goal in Syria, it's obvious, it's to steal Syria's oil and wheat, as multiple officials have openly expressed from Trump to Dana Stroul, who's now a senior official under Biden. What is the hegemonic interest in staying in Somalia?
Well, it's geopolitics. And we actually published a great piece by Tim Coles, who wrote a really important book about British involvement, military involvement in Africa, contemporary British military involvement, drawing on the history of British colonialism. But I really would recommend, for a deeper background, this piece we published in August 2021 by TJ Coles, or Tim Coles. In Somalia, the U.S. is bombing the very quote-unquote terrorists it created. It's a long piece, and I learned a lot from editing it. But it's about the Horn of Africa. I mean, the Horn of Africa is one of the most strategic places on the planet for trade, for waterways. It's like the South China Sea, or it's why the U.S. wants control of the Philippines. These are important trade routes where the U.S. needs complete control.
Right.
And Ethiopia, I mean, you have a major dam project there, the Renaissance Dam, which is part of the Belt and Road Initiative, China's Belt and Road Initiative. And it's going to make Ethiopia a regional power, a mid-level power. I mean, Ethiopia has the capacity to be a kind of Turkey in the region. And the U.S. obviously isn't happy about that. Its old friends in the TPLF turned to them to try to destabilize this government and failed. But having a presence in Somalia, has a presence in Djibouti as well. These are drone bases. This is where drone activity is taking place. And unfortunately, Gates's resolution didn't say anything about U.S. drone activity in Somalia. Ilhan Omar did pipe up to criticize the failure to challenge the drone project, the constant drone operations in Somalia. However, she made the absurd implication that President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed will eliminate al-Shabaab within a year. And what Gates was saying was, they're both saying, let's let the native Somali forces fight this fight. But it's absurd that that's going to happen. It's not going to happen. There needs to be a negotiation. Ilhan Omar just really not taking the lead and not saying anything of real significance here and letting Gates take the lead is kind of telling when this is her country. Of course, and zero Democrats co-sponsoring is also telling. It's depressing. So, do you want to move on to Ukraine, or you want to add anything?
Yeah, no. Let's move on. So, this is the picture we got just a month ago from Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin when he was speaking to Congress, and we've been hearing messages like this for a very, very long time, that basically Ukraine is in a good position, they're winning, they have the upper hand. And this soundbite from Lloyd Austin captures it. So this is what Lloyd Austin said. This is March 28th, Lloyd Austin speaking to the Senate.
With regard to your optimism about Ukraine having the upper hand, that is what you told me.
It is. Now, what I was about to say, Senator, is that Ukrainians have inflicted significant casualties on the Russians, and they have depleted their inventory of armored vehicles in a way that no one would have ever imagined. And so now we see Russia reaching for T-54s and T-55 tanks because of the level of damage that the Ukrainians have inflicted on them. And we have, in the meantime, been
reaching for those tanks demonstrates what to use them.
It demonstrates that their capability is waning, and we've continued to witness them be challenged with artillery munitions, in other things, and they're reaching out to Iran, they're reaching out to North Korea. I think we'll see an increase in the fighting in the spring as conditions for maneuver improve. And based upon the things that we've done and continue to do, I think Ukraine will have a real good chance.
Do you believe?
Yep.
So that's Lloyd Austin, March 28th, telling the Senate under oath that he thinks Ukraine has a real good chance of success. Well, then a few days later comes the Pentagon leaks, and they reveal that actually in private, the Pentagon feels much differently. They feel this is from the Washington Post. U.S. doubts Ukraine counteroffensive will yield big gains, leaked document says. It's a marked departure from the Biden administration's public pronouncements about the vitality of Ukraine's army and is likely to embolden critics calling for negotiations to end the war. So that is the Pentagon being contradicted in what it says publicly by what it discloses privately in these leaks. And that's why maybe we're starting to see now some more headlines that are basically starting to prepare the groundwork for Ukraine to lose. So here is one example from Politico. This just came out recently. And here it is. This is and this comes from someone inside the Biden camp. Biden's team fears the aftermath of a failed Ukrainian counteroffensive. Behind closed doors, the administration worries about what Ukraine can accomplish. So I think reality is sinking in. I think they're basically preparing to throw as many Ukrainians as they can at Russia, see what they can accomplish in the spring. And if nothing happens, then that's laying the groundwork to basically call this proxy war off. So basically, let's sacrifice some Ukrainians one last time. Let's give it a go and see what they can do. But after that, I think they're trying to set the stage for backing off of the proxy war. Now that we learn what they're actually acknowledging privately, which is that they don't think Ukraine can win.
Yeah, and if you actually read that Politico article and parse the details, it's citing unnamed U.S. officials who are likely those people planning some kind of off-ramp close to the Biden administration, who basically provided Politico with the script, and then they handed over their outside experts who are loyal to Biden, like Richard Haas, the head of the Council on Foreign Relations, who said, doesn't seem like a counteroffensive is going to yield what we want. Why? Because all the Ukrainian who can fight, who are trained by the US and the British and NATO, are dead. We threw them into the slaughterhouse in order to weaken Russia, cynically, without any care about Ukrainians as actual men, brothers, husbands, fathers, people. They're just what we've always said they were, and I've been saying this for years. They're just bullet stoppers for empire. It's really disgusting. This is
Lindsey Graham openly admitted when he said that as long as we continue to provide Ukraine with support, they will fight to the last person. He outright admitted it. That is the official policy. Let me show you something funny from this Politico article, because they're talking about how then the Biden administration will try to sell Ukraine on a ceasefire. And so it says this. It says this. Hopefully you can see this. There has been discussion per aides of framing it to the Ukrainians as a ceasefire and not as permanent peace talks, leaving the door open for Ukraine to regain more of its territory at a future date. Well, what's funny about that is that's exactly what Antony Blinken was saying China was trying to do. He said China's call for a ceasefire is a cynical trap that will freeze the conflict and allow Russia to take more territory at a later date. Now, this is how the U.S. is trying to sell Ukraine on that very same prospect, because they're realizing finally that this has to eventually come to an end, because they don't have, as you say, Max, the forces left to keep this proxy war going much longer.
Yeah, I mean, you can see the pathetic and desperate attempts in Western media to try to create the sense that there is some hope. And you saw in like the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, all these other papers, they're like, there are some indications from Telegram groups like Russian Rybar, a pro-war Telegram channel. I can't believe they're calling anyone pro-war, that Ukrainian troops have advanced across the Dnipro River, but they can't prove that they're there. And it's probably a tactical withdrawal by Russia to dig themselves in even further for a Ukrainian counteroffensive. Then I might have missed it, but I think Medea Benjamin was able to actually confront Nancy Pelosi at some environmental conference. And she said, why don't we just negotiate now instead of wasting so many more lives? And Pelosi said, what we need now is victory. But none of them can define victory or what it will take to get there. And I think what they mean is taking Crimea, which is impossible. And if it even happened, it would lead to an insane escalation. I wanted to, well, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
I have that clip of Pelosi being confronted. If you want to,
yeah,
hear it. Okay. I haven't seen this, but this is what Code Pink released.
Run up the stairs of the U.S. Capitol in 4-inch heels knows that this woman is a force.
Oh my God.
Nancy Pelosi.
You can run up the steps of the Capitol with heels on.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Mary. Thank you for your kind introduction and for excellent inspiring words earlier this evening. As the mayor of the House and one who cares deeply about our plans, our planet, and as a proud San Francisco, it is a special honor to join in celebrating the 34th Annual Goldman Environmental Prize awardees. Let us again applaud our six outstanding winners: Shalakwa, Sagar, Tara, Diane, and Galina, as well as Alexandra.
So Code Pink is now on stage interrupting.
Now, as we go forward, we know accepting. Could you give us, as a courtesy to our awardees, you've made your point, as a courtesy to our awardees and to the Goldman family, we hear you, we respect you. Please take your place. Please take your place. Please take your place. Please take your place. Okay. To this audience, thank you for being here tonight. Because when
I don't know, there might have been some further exchanges between Nancy Pelosi and Medea, but she was interrupted by Code Pink on Ukraine. And I didn't actually, did she say we need victory?
Yeah, so according to Medea Benjamin, prior to the event, Pelosi told Medea, quote, "We don't need peace talks, we need victory."
What does this even mean?
Yeah,
so
what does victory mean? Like, does she mean retaking Crimea? Is that what she means? Or ethnically cleansing the Donbass? Like, what does she mean by victory?
Marching on Moscow. I mean,
yeah.
Well, here's an interesting avenue where the conflict could go diplomatically. China has put a peace plan on the table. It is serious. I mean, Xi Jinping has appointed an envoy, a special envoy, to negotiate between Ukraine and Russia. Of course, Zelensky's owned. He's a marionette of the U.S. But at a certain point, there's the possibility China can provide an off-ramp, and this would be the biggest humiliation to Tony Blinken and the Biden administration after what already happened with China negotiating some kind of de-escalation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which is just great for humanity, horrible for the U.S. State Department. So there was this private conference. This is an article from March of former top U.S. soldiers, intelligence officials, and scholars with resumes from the Reagan to the Trump administration. And they all basically said, one speaker rose up, there were Chatham House rules, so it's all off the record. But one speaker argued that Zelensky should consider the Chinese peace plan, especially after Beijing's successful mediation of the Iraqi-Saudi dispute. Of course, the great majority of participants favored risking everything for absolute victory over Russia, None mentioned the qualms that former President Trump voiced on May 17th about the risk of nuclear escalation in Ukraine. I think that means that's March 17th. And one of the disclosures that this article makes based on this meeting, I think the author got kind of a readout of the meeting or spoke to the participants, is how dire the situation is for Ukrainian forces. They wrote, it isn't that Ukraine will literally run out of live bodies, but that the quality of its armed forces, enlisted men as well as officers, has deteriorated. Critical parts of the civilian economy will collapse as manpower shifted to the military. Unrecoverable casualties, those killed or seriously wounded, 120,000 Ukrainian dead or seriously wounded, taken out of commission, 120,000 with a population much smaller than Russia's. Other estimates from expert US analysts are higher, but the strategic conclusion is the same. With a much larger military, Russia will win a war of attrition. And so you have some of these extremist experts, they're arguing for crazy things like giving Ukraine 1,000 Abrams tanks. Like, where are they going to come from? The US would run out of tanks, and it takes so long for the US to produce those tanks and to train them. You also have disclosures from some of these experts that they talked to Ukrainian troops in the field, and they said that in their battalion there was only one man who knew how to operate a US manufactured grenade launcher. Because the rest of them who'd been trained had all been killed. So I just don't see where the hope is for this supposed counteroffensive that, according, by the way, to Pentagon leaks, was supposed to have been launched on April 30th. I think that's the date that Hitler died. So maybe they changed it.
And Zelensky's still talking about this war could go on for over a decade. I don't know what's going on with him, but he is in a horrible position because he has to, if he engages, I mean, how would, for example, the Azov battalion and Right Sector and all these fascist groups respond if he actually seriously engages with China's peace plan? I think he'd get cooed or even worse, physically hurt, which they'd
have to purge them. I mean, remember the missile strike on the Azov prisoners when they were held by Russia in Donetsk?
Right.
So there was a missile strike that killed dozens of top Azov fighters from Mariupol who were being held by Russia. They were being interrogated, and it was a Ukrainian strike on their own people in Azov. Maybe because they were going to disclose secrets.
Was that confirmed? I know that was the allegation, but I think
that was a very plausible allegation. But
okay, yeah. I forgot about that. That was They were, and the suspicion there was that basically Ukraine was killing its own forces to prevent them from spilling secrets, and then Ukraine said that Russia had actually killed them, and we haven't heard much about that since. That's something in Western media where there's been no follow-up from what I can see. That's one of these incidents that happens and then it just gets forgotten. And when there's not, it's kind of like Nord Stream. When there's a dogged effort to ignore a pivotal incident like that, then you have to wonder about whether, the U.S. establishment does not want us to get to the truth when there's so little interest in finding it out.
Yeah, and so I think this war was supposed to go differently for everyone. I think Russia thought that it would have been much shorter, that there would have been negotiations. When Russian troops were in the Kiev Oblast and sending this giant caravan of armored vehicles, Boris Johnson comes in, says, we will arm you to the teeth, keep fighting. The Ukrainian military performs very well, exacts a lot of harm on the Russian military. But now the situation is stabilized throughout the Donbass. And that looks like how the conflict may shape up, that there could be,
That timeline you lay out there, it really captures how cynical U.S. policy is, because so initially, Ukraine gets invaded by Russia. You have these peace talks. Initially, the Zelensky government actually uses the peace talks to stall for time. That's when they killed that envoy of their own, like that Ukrainian envoy.
Denis Karyev was killed in the streets of Kiev after returning from negotiations.
And later on, the Ukrainian official who sent him there said we're using those peace talks to stall for time. But then you have actually serious talks because Ukraine starts realizing that they're getting pummeled. This is in March of 2022. They come to the outline of an agreement. Everybody confirms this. The former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett confirms this. The former Turkish foreign minister confirms this. Zelensky confirms this, speaking to the Ukrainian media. And then Boris Johnson comes, as you said, and tells him, no, we're not. If you reach a peace deal, we're not going to back you up, which makes a peace deal for Zelensky impossible if he doesn't have Western backing. So then the U.S. basically, to reward Zelensky, that's when they flood Ukraine with all these weapons. Yes, they had poured in a lot of weaponry before, but the real influx comes after Boris Johnson sabotages those peace talks, and that's what prolongs the war, and that's what allows Ukraine to have some success when they rout Russian forces from Kharkiv. But that also comes at a huge cost, where they lost so many people in the process. And then Russia escalates further in the fall of 2022. That's when you see Russia really taking the gloves off and going after infrastructure that they had previously avoided. That was acknowledged in the New York Times and,
Right.
and many other places. So it's so like that timeline you lay out there is so cynical, because all this could have been avoided, but the U.S. clearly wanted to keep this going for as long as possible. And now we're seeing the result. And here's another inconvenient admission. This was made to Congress this week by General Christopher Cavoli. He is the head of the European Command. And this is what he said about the state of Russian forces.
The Russian ground force has been degenerated somewhat by this conflict, although it is bigger today than it was at the beginning of the conflict. The Air Force has lost very little. They've lost 80 planes. They have another 1,000 fighters and fighter bombers. The Navy has lost one ship. So they still use all of that conventional power as well, and they mix them all together.
So that's the head of the U.S. European Command admitting that the Russian ground force is now bigger than it was at the start of the war. So what's the import of that message? While Ukraine's been decimated, they do have some battalions in reserve that have been training, but Ukraine's lost a lot of people. Russia's force, meanwhile, is bigger than it was at the start of the war. So it's obvious what that leads to. It leads to Russia continuing its advances and Ukraine having no chance, but yet still the Biden administration wants to give it one last go.
Yeah, New York Times has a piece, not in front of me, this week or last week it came out about the dismal hopes for a Ukrainian counteroffensive, echoing Politico. And I guess obviously the Biden administration is green lighting these kinds of takes. And it quotes Ukrainian soldiers in the field. Yeah, there it is. One of them saying, I don't know where Russia's getting all this ammunition from. Remember when Bellingcat's Christo Grozev, their in-house Russia director, predicted back in April 2022 that Russia had already run out of ammo and that the war would be over? I mean, we were constantly hearing about Russia running out of ammo. Now it's Ukraine running out of ammo. And this is an ammunition battle around Bakhmut. This is an ammunition battle because the lines are so fortified with so much mines that tanks are essentially, I wouldn't say their effectiveness is nullified, but they're just playing the ammunition game too. It's kind of a stalemate, and it's about manpower. Like in Bakhmut, how long can Ukrainians hold on? How long can Zelensky continue to reinforce them? We were told it wasn't strategic, but Zelensky said it was the Battle of Saratoga. Well, how long can they hold on if they're all basically dead? Not long. So where are the negotiations, and where is Europe going to land on this? We saw what happened with Macron going to China with Ursula von der Leyen as his kind of minder. Von der Leyen was there to kind of make sure he didn't do anything too independent, too much in the interest of France, because von der Leyen, she sees the EU as essentially a transatlantic vehicle. Then he gets rid of her, and then the party begins with him and Xi Jinping, and he says that France is not going to be submissive to U.S. power any longer, and gives all his pre-prepared comments to Politico, basically sounding like Charles de Gaulle. Fascinating. The U.S. is terrified of what Europe is going to do this winter. It needs to get this over with. Kit Clarenberg our friend Kit Clarenberg, contributor to the Grayzone, had this tweet that I think really spells it all out well and emphasizes the urgency of negotiations for Europe. So this is how it's supposed to go. The West must hit Russian economy harder, says Liz Truss. Remember when she was PM? That was awesome. It was like a 2-hour stint. UK Foreign Secretary reveals Moscow now cannot access 60% of foreign currency reserves. And remember when Joe Biden said the ruble has been reduced to rubble? Well, this is today. It's how it started, how it's going. Britons need to accept they're poor, says Bank of England economist. Chief economist Hugh Pill, another great name. It's like Ed Ball. They have all these great names. Ed Balls, they have all these great names in the UK. Hugh Pill says workers and firms should stop trying to pass on rising costs by hiking prices or demanding better wages. So, and I mean, we have inflation in the US. It's not going great here, but in Europe, it's much more dire. The energy situation is not improved. They haven't built the LNG ports in Germany yet to receive US liquid natural gas to displace the gas from Nord Stream. So I think we could be looking at, okay, I don't want to make that prediction, but it would be insane to me if the US was able to sustain this conflict for another year.
Check this one out. This is from Bloomberg. Russia is less likely to have a recession than any G7 country except for Japan. So the highest probability goes to UK, then New Zealand, then US, then Germany, then Italy, Canada, France. Russia is less likely than all of those to have a recession, according to Bloomberg. And I mean, it's just, you know, the rhetoric is really amazing. The US was so cocky, like you quoted that thing from Biden, the ruble is now rubble. You know, Bill Burns, who's supposed to be the, you know, the cool-headed diplomatic head of the CIA, he wrote a memoir called The Back Channel, all about negotiating, which he's done a lot of. He said that the US aim with sanctions is to impact generations of Russians, not just Russia currently, which is sadistic enough. He said generations of Russians will be impacted by our sanctions. And that was the plan. This was the whole plan all along, to provoke Russia into this war, use it to bleed Russia for as long as possible, and then use the war to justify imposing sanctions that, to quote Bill Burns, would hurt generations of Russians. If your concern really was just deterring Russia, stopping it from invading Ukraine, why would you be bragging about imposing sanctions that will hurt generations of Russians for years to come? I mean, and the plan it hasn't worked out, which is humiliating. And now we're seeing that. And that's why, as you mentioned earlier, other countries are increasingly more independent. That is a fallout from this war. You know, Saudi Arabia, they had to look at what happened to Ukraine, how Ukraine's been decimated and used by the U.S., and how fickle the U.S. is with its loyalty. And to see how the war in Ukraine went, that had to impact their thinking and why they've become more independent of the U.S., talking to Iran, talking to Syria, not following U.S. orders when it comes to OPEC prices. I mean, this is all a result of the war. So really, what the U.S. intended for Russia is in some ways being mirror imaged onto them as a result of this proxy war and all the losses.
Yeah, we're going to see. BRICS meeting is coming up in South Africa this August. We're already seeing the South African government tell the ICC to go to hell for its arrest warrant for Putin. What if Iran and Saudi Arabia join BRICS? I mean, what's the U.S. going to do then? They're working on de-dollarization. They're working on developing a BRICS bank that will present a completely alternative financial system. U.S. sanctions are going to reach a point where they can no longer work, and they're going to simply harm generations of Americans and Europeans. What will be the political response in the West? We should be following the BRICS meeting extremely closely. All of the factors playing out there, the end of dollar hegemony, have been accelerated by the U.S. gearing up this proxy war. And a new world order is coming into view. And I guess we don't have time to review it, but Sergei Lavrov's comments at the UN were really interesting because he basically threw down the gauntlet before the UN leadership itself after they revoked the visas of Russian media so they could not cover the meeting. And he said that he asked, is the UN actually a neutral organization? When it seems to be conceding to the diplomatic terrorism of its host country. And he called out the IMF as well. I mean, this is extremely significant to see Lavrov call out the IMF itself as an instrument of US power, it signals that Russia, China, and these other mid-level powers are seeking to replace the IMF. And that is not, it's not going to bode well for our grandchildren, Aaron. I don't know if you're going to have grandchildren. I don't know if I'm going to know them, but it doesn't bode well for their economic future in the United States. And that's the fault of these psychopaths in the Biden White House, and the Newlands and the neocons. They did this.
Yes, they did. And the idea of them having another 4 years in office is pretty scary. And yeah, it's hard to even fathom. I didn't think there could be a worse administration, a worse like national security cabinet than Trump's. He had John Bolton, Elliott Abrams, Mike Pompeo. That was up there with the Bush administration and being the worst, and up there with the Obama administration too. But I actually think that the Biden administration's national security team has surpassed the Trump national security team in being even worse. And Trump, by the way, now is talking as if he's, not going to repeat that mistake. He's talking about taking on the neocons and purging the State Department of neocons. And, he said something similar in 2016. So not like I take him at face value, but at least he's talking about not allowing these people to run the government anymore. Whereas in the Biden administration, that's who's in charge, just without question. And they've obviously done a good job in purging anybody who dissents, because at least under Obama, you had some leaks that would undermine the neocons inside the cabinet. Like when it came time when Obama was going to bomb Syria after Syria was accused of a chemical attack, which we know, of course, was a false flag by sectarian death squads. All the evidence shows that they actually used sarin in Ghouta in 2013. But there were leaks coming out from the Obama administration saying that the intelligence blaming Assad was not a slam dunk. And that was their obvious way from the people leaking this to say that this was an Iraq WMD situation. We don't see those kind of leaks coming out today from the Biden White House. And so that says that they've done a great job at purging people who might have a different point of view than the neocons like Sullivan and Blinken and Newland.
Yeah, I could go on and on about it, but I mean, it's a very dangerous administration moving towards conflict with China. And there will be a ruthless attempt to prevent Trump from getting back into the White House for precisely the same reason that Tucker had to be ousted from Fox News, because they were a disruptive presence within the Beltway foreign policy consensus. It's just that simple. Even on China, I mean, as anti-China as Trump might have seemed, he spoke about Xi Jinping with some level of respect. He called him his great friend during rallies. He was willing to speak to him directly. The diplomacy between the U.S. and China has completely collapsed under Biden.
Oh, yeah. Blinken canceled a trip over the balloon.
And then they started shooting down literal hobby balloons and telling Americans with F-22s and F-35s and telling Americans that China was, trying to convince them they were everywhere. Yeah. I mean, of course, a lot of America Firsters played into that, but this was the silliest, most juvenile act in foreign policy. And where does it leave us? It leaves us with massive amounts of weapons transfers to Taiwan, which is great for the arms industry. And the Biden administration leaning on Tsai's administration against the Kuomintang, the KMT, who actually do want negotiations with China. They're getting involved in internal Taiwanese politics. Anyway, I could just go on and on and on, but I see that it makes me see George W. Bush in a different light, as just a kind of a tool of the same elements that are running Biden. I used to think, he's a cowboy. He's trying to screw over his father because he wouldn't go all the way. Yeah, that might have been true, but it's really about the forces, the permanent bureaucracy, and the neocons and how they've gotten tentacles.
Obama as well. Like, I don't think Obama was passionate about regime change in Libya or Syria. He just came in and everyone was telling him that that's what he had to do, and he didn't have the conviction and the principle to stand up to them.
Yeah, what's the common thread, Aaron? Victoria Nuland, Chief of Staff to Dick Cheney.
That's
Victoria Nuland, Assistant Secretary of State to Barack Obama. Victoria Nuland, Assistant Secretary of State to Joe Biden. Victoria Nuland, married to Robert Kagan. Robert Kagan, partner of Bill Kristol in Project for a New American Century. It's like the neocons have been in the building all that time.
That's right. Yep.
And
yeah.
Anyway, I think it's a good place to wrap up. This was a great stream. Great comments from most of you.
Most of you, yes, most of you.
And,
but we appreciate it all. Thanks everyone for watching, and remember to like the stream, and we'll see you next time.
Peace. And watch Aaron on Jimmy. Are you still doing Jimmy Dore?
Yep, all this week.
Great. So check out Aaron on Jimmy Dore all week.
And catch the Grayzone on WBI, right? And where else? KPF.
WBI, KPFK. I mean, if anyone watches it, listens to Pacifica, we're trying to keep the anti-war sentiment going at that station, which many of the shows are going the way of democracy now. And I'm hoping, by the way, to do something on Sudan. So look out for that. Trying to keep all these bases covered. Thanks again. Thanks for all your support. Thanks for liking this stream. Thanks for supporting us on Patreon, supporting us directly at PayPal, or whatever you can do, all the moral support. And we'll see Vladimir Zelensky performing at Zanies in Chicago next year if he doesn't get a seat in the Israeli Knesset.
Peace, everybody.